Alright, welcome to the third video in the Lesson 3 playlist, a walkthrough of the slides. Now, right off the bat, it might seem a little odd that these slides are called Beyond Grammar, because, isn't this the grammar portion of this SAT class? But if you remember back to Lesson 1, I said that not all of the writing and language test is going to be about grammar. Only about 50% of the questions on the test actually evaluate grammar. There's a lot of rules, so we spent 2 whole lessons on it, but we need to cover the other 50% of the questions, and that's what we're going to do today. And I've summarized what these questions cover with this, these 3 words: substance, structure, and style. They're really questions about general writing conventions, organization, flow, vocabulary, and certainly substance, structure, and style of writing. So it's stuff that's in the writing and language portion of the test, interspersed with grammar questions, but doesn't actually, or questions that don't actually explicitly test on grammar. All right, so let's jump in. And the general flow of this presentation, a little different than the past ones, is that we're going to look at a particular type of question on the test, not like a grammatical rule or something, but a particular type of question, and then an example of it, and think about strategies for how to solve them. So the first type of question is transition sentence question. These are questions that will ask you to revise a passage so that ideas better transition from one to another. Now, what you want to think about with transition sentences is that they need to connect ideas. So if sentence 10 is a transition, it needs to connect to the idea in sentence 9 and in sentence 11. It has to connect to the sentence before and after it in order to really be correctly placed. So we'll look at an example. Most transportation planners work in or near cities, and the majority are employed by government agencies. Say, for example, a large factory is built on the outskirts of a small town. Now we want to know which choice results in the most effective transition to the information that follows in the paragraph. Take a second to think about it. Alright, so if we just leave it as it is, let's think. Does this transition to both the portion of the sentence before and the sentence after? The majority are employed by government agencies. That's clearly continuing on the thought of this beginning clause, but it doesn't really relate to a large factory being built in a small town. So A is probably not right. Where job opportunities are plentiful, okay, again, that relates to cities, but then it doesn't relate to the factory being built in a small town. Transitions from the first, but not to the second. B is probably not right. C, some are employed in rural areas. Some transportation planners are employed in rural areas. Okay, that seems to connect to the first part. And then we say a factory is built on the outskirts of a small town, which would be a rural area. So this seems to transition to both portions. So C is the best answer we've seen so far. And then if we delete this portion, then the sentences really don't transition, and it's even worse. So C is going to be the best answer here, and that's what we choose. The next topic is transition words, which is a distinct topic from transition sentences. Now we're not talking about changing the placement of an entire sentence, we're just talking about changing a single word that comes usually at the beginning of a sentence. So transition words are used to indicate the author's logic, and the way to break down these types of questions is to think about transition words as being grouped into 5 main categories: positive words, negative words, specificity words, chronology words, and cause and effect words. And we'll go through each of these on the following slides, but a pro tip overall strategy before we even get started is that the SAT will never ask you to choose between 2 words in the same category. So these questions will often say, what's the most effective transition word? If you see 4 from 4 separate categories, you just have to work through it. But if you see 3 words from chronology and 1 from positive, you automatically know that the positive word is correct. because they'll never make you choose between different words in the same category. These questions are really testing you on which category of transition word is correct, and so if you see multiple words from the same category, get rid of them and choose from the remaining options. All right, slide 2 of 3. The first category is positive words. This means that the author is continuing to discuss a similar subject. We're transitioning between two sentences, two ideas, where the second idea is just continuing in the same line of thought as the first. Some examples are furthermore, similarly, in addition, also, and likewise. Negative, the next category. These type of words indicate that the author is going to discuss something different from what was previously discussed. It's the direct opposite of positive. Positive, you're continuing on the line of thought. Negative, we're switching to an opposite one. So these are words we see a lot in writing: unlike, in contrast, as opposed to, however, yet, although, whereas, even so, nevertheless. They're all negative. And again, negative doesn't mean bad. Positive doesn't mean good. They mean continuing or changing lines of thought. Specificity. The third category, this is pretty intuitive. It indicates the author is going to get more specific about the same subject matter. There's only really two examples I can think of, which are for instance and for example. Chronology. The fourth category indicates some ordering or sequencing of events. Just like the word chronological, this indicates some order. So then, next, afterwards, before, subsequently, indicates when things happened in time. And then finally, cause and effect, again pretty obvious, indicates that one thing caused another, or that one part of an argument logically results from another. So it doesn't have to be events causing another, but it could be one part of an argument sort of logically causing another to arise. So I think the meaning of this is intuitive, but students often don't know that all of these examples are cause and effect words. Some of them are big and sort of antiquated, but the SAT will expect them to know these. Consequently, hence, as a result of, due to, because, therefore, so that, from which, thereby, and whereby, all indicate cause and effect. A logical question here is, should students memorize all these words? Like, these are just examples. And my answer is probably yes. It's not essential, but if students just know these categories and then they're unable to place the words they see on the test into the categories, it's not going to be very helpful, and they're going to have a hard time choosing between words. So students really need to know not only what these 5 categories are, what they mean, but also which words fall into which categories. These are only examples. The SAT could ask about other words, but these are the most frequent ones I've seen, and if students only knew the words on these slides, they would get by pretty well on any exam. Yeah. So a sample question. I'll let you read through this for a second. And because the examples on these slides tend to be sort of long, I'm not going to just pause for a while. If you want to read through it first, pause the video and read through it and guess at the answer, and then watch my explanation. But I'm just going to sort of breeze through it and assume that you've already read it. So, for this example, what should we replace this transition word with? Well, first, let's go down here and try my strategy of seeing whether any of these fall in the same category. For instance, that's specificity. Next, well, that's chronology. Furthermore, that's positive, and similarly is positive. So right off the bat, we can eliminate C and D. The SAT will not make us choose between 2 positive words. Neither one will ever be, quote-unquote, better than another. So let's get rid of those. So it's either A or B. So now we ask, is this a situation where we want to get more specific, or where we're showing some sequence in time? And what we're really doing here is just providing an example. We're talking about transportation planners working with community stakeholders, and then we give an example of how community stakeholders might contribute to a project. So for instance is the perfect word, and that's what we'll choose. All right, moving sentences. The SAT will also ask, where in a paragraph should we move a sentence? And the idea here is that you want to make the flow, a logical flow of ideas and organization in the paragraph optimal. These questions often don't have clear-cut answers, but they do have best answers. And so you want to just sort of read through the choices and think, what's the best way to organize this paragraph? Some other questions, think about the main idea of the sentence and the main idea of the paragraph and sort of where that sentence would best align in the paragraph. And this last point is also key. This is not about deep textual analysis. That is saved for the reading portion of the SAT. In the writing section, this is just about rote organization. You don't have to analyze anything. Okay, sample question. Again, assuming you've read through this already, what's the best answer here? I'm going to just reveal it before I explain it. The best answer is B. And when you first saw this, you might not have chosen B. When I first saw this question, I don't know, 3 years ago or something, I didn't choose B. And I think this is a very good example because it's an SAT question that's not really intuitive. You have to break it down in a detailed manner. So if we look at sentence 5, does it fit where it is now? The age of diagramming sentences and laboring over the difference between verb tenses is gone. Let's think what's happening before and what's happening after. Well, what's happening before is that we're talking about proper speech and that it's just the province of people who consider themselves proper. And then after, and that doesn't really connect to the age of diagramming sentences. Maybe you could say it could because this is an example of proper speech, but it doesn't really strongly connect. Then the sentence after, sentence 6, for all the people who complain about it, what's the difference between past perfect and present perfect? That seems to connect very well to sentence 5. So we have one sort of maybe connection and one good connection. So let's say A is a maybe for now. Now let's look at C. Okay, C. So if we move this sentence after sentence 2, well, what are these sentences 2 and 3 talking about now? Right now, 2 is talking about how most English classes have this implicit claim, people learn to write by writing. And then 3 says, well, also implicit in this claim is that grammar no longer has the practical objective or egalitarian purpose that it once did. And right now, these sentences connect very well to one another. If we placed this random sentence about diagramming and verb tenses in between them, it would really destroy the flow between them and it wouldn't provide anything. So we can say A is a maybe and C is just out. Then choice D. Choice D says, and this disappears, after sentence 6. Okay. For all that people complain about it, what's the difference between past perfect and present perfect? Well, we said in choice A that 6 does seem to connect to 5, but it doesn't connect to all of 5. 5 also talks about the age of diagramming sentences being over. And 6 sort of just focuses on verb tenses, which is just a phrase in sentence 5. So there is some connection if you put 5 after 6, but it's not a great connection. So we'll call 6 a maybe. So right now A is a maybe, D is a maybe, C is out. Let's look at B. Studying grammar rules seems to be a thing of the past. Then we'd say the age of diagramming sentences, blah, 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 is gone. Well, that connects really well. We said it's a thing of the past, and then we're elaborating on that and saying that it's gone. And then sentence 2 says, instead, today they're focusing on this. Well, again, this seems to connect well. We're giving an example of something, and then we're transitioning with instead and switching to a new idea. So this sentence fits really well between sentences 1 and 2, and so we'll call for a good answer choice. And now we have 2 maybes and 1 good, and so we can get rid of A and D. They weren't that good. Compared to B, they're not the best answer here. So you can see from this long explanation that this is a difficult question. There's not a real clear-cut answer or way of solving it, but I think the best way to do it is to think about, for this sentence 5, will it relate to the sentence before it and the sentence after it? And in only one case does there a really strong connection between the sentences before and after. But this is tricky. You have to sort of do this by feel, but nonetheless, the SAT does ask questions like this. So, next, summary questions. Sometimes the SAT will ask you to summarize the main point of a passage. And again, they're not going to ask you to do deep analysis. They're just going to ask you, think about what's the main idea of the passage and which of these answer choices summarizes that. Another strategy is that you can use the process of elimination to get rid of things that are immediately wrong. Sometimes they'll put choices that are clearly not the main idea of a passage, and that's just wrong. And you can also try to find textual evidence that proves the answer is correct. So don't just guess about the main idea of a passage and which sentence summarizes it. Find some textual evidence to back up what the main idea of the passage is, and then choose the answer choice that reflects that, as I said. All right, another sample. So this is the same passage we had before, but now instead of moving sentences, we're asking what's the best way to conclude it with a question that summarizes the main idea. Should we keep this or replace it? So again, first we want to think, what's the main idea of this passage? What is it? If we read through it, the main idea seems to be that the conventions of English grammar are no longer as important today. They're being neglected for other approaches to teaching writing. And in fact, teaching the conventions of grammar is sort of elitist because it's just a product of people who consider themselves proper. Okay, that's sort of the main idea of this passage in one sentence. So let's see which of these questions reflects it. For all that people complain about it, what's the difference between the past, present, and present perfect? That doesn't really seem to summarize that whole main idea. That's just like an example of differences between tenses. Option B, who's to say, after all, that the speech of a particular class, region, or race is better than any other? Yeah, that does seem to agree with the main idea we just said about proper grammar, the conventions of grammar sort of being elitist, and just a product of people who consider themselves proper. So that could work. C, kids hate learning grammar and teachers hate... No, this passage didn't talk about that at all. That's wrong. And D, why is it so difficult for native English speakers? We didn't talk about it at all. So C and D are just clearly wrong. A is also too specific, and B is the best of the options given. It's not perfect. We could probably think of a better way to summarize this, but it's the best of the options listed. So B is the right answer. Most wrong answer questions. And then an oxymoron. No, these are questions that ask for the most wrong or least acceptable answer choice of those given. These are often easier to solve than other questions on the test because you can often approach them without even reading the passage that they're referring to. Let's look at this. So here I have, which of the following alternatives to the underlined portion would be least acceptable? But I'm not showing you, and you won't be showing your students, the passage. That's sort of weird. Can we really solve this question without reading the passage? Yeah, what we can do is just find the choice that doesn't belong. So here we have however, nevertheless, therefore, and even so. Well, let's think about this in terms of what we learned earlier. However, nevertheless, and even so are negative words. They're indicating that the author is switching from one topic to another. Therefore is a cause and effect word. So we have 3 negative words and 1 cause and effect word. The odd man out is the cause and effect word, therefore, and so it's probably the least acceptable. And we can just choose C without even reading the passage. Now, the point of this is not that students shouldn't actually read the passage. They should read the passage, definitely. But this is a strategy to use. If you see a least acceptable answer question, and 3 of the answers seem very closely related, and 1 of them is very different, the one that's very different is usually the correct one. But not always. They should read the passage. Okay, contrast questions. Questions that ask you to establish a contrast. That sounds weird, but actually these questions, again, are pretty simple. They're just asking you, to find words or phrases that are the direct opposite of words or phrases in the first part of the sentence. For example, okay, which of the following choices best helps to establish a contrast with the earlier part of the sentence? Well, the choice that we have here, Takihara, I think that's how it's pronounced, who was born 30 years before Mishima and died before the war. Well, the first part of this sentence is talking about contemporary French and German poets, and then the second part's talking about someone who was born before someone else. That doesn't seem to be a contrast. There's no direct opposites. If we change it to a master of the classical Japanese poetic form, the waka, well, that seems to work a little better. Now we have contemporary, that's the direct opposite of classical, French and German. Well, that's clearly not a direct opposite of Japanese, but these are different countries, so those are opposite in some way. That might work. Takihara, who is less well known to Western audiences, the first part doesn't talk about Western audiences. And lastly, who had a great reader, who had also been a great reader of the German poet who knows how to pronounce that, and it's also wrong because this first part of the sentence doesn't refer to that, and this is not a direct opposite. So the best answer here is B. The next type of question we're going to look at is justified answer choice. These are questions that don't just ask what's correct, they ask what is correct and why. Some questions you can think about are listed on the slide. So if we look at this sample question, what should we do with the phrase of the Old South? Should we keep it? Should we delete it? So first you need to decide whether keep it or delete it, and then you need to decide which explanation is better. I think you could sort of solve this by yourself and then look at the choices, or look at the choices and then figure out the answer through that. Either one could work. I think for this particular question, just going through the options is the easiest way to solve. So option A, kept, because it is the only mention of the Old South in the entire passage. Okay, it's the only mention, but why does that mean we have to keep it? A is not really convincing. B, kept, because it clarifies the metaphor. Well, that might work, because many skeptics insisted that Grady's New South was really just a mirror image, period. If we delete the phrase and we put the period there, you're left saying a mirror image of what? It's not clear from the sentence. And again, mirror image is a metaphor, so this seems to work. It clarifies the metaphor, and it does seem like this phrase should be kept, because if we delete it, we're left saying of what? So B seems the best answer so far. Should it be deleted because it presents information that appears elsewhere? No, this doesn't appear anywhere else. C is wrong. And D, deleted because it creates an image that is offensive to supporters of Grady. Maybe it does. Who cares? That's not a reason to delete it. So the correct answer here, or the best answer, is B. All right. The writer is considering questions. These are questions that take the form. At this point, the writer is considering adding this sentence. And here you just want to think about the same things we've been thinking about earlier. You know, how the sentence is logically organized, does this transition, and also, is this necessary? If you're just adding redundant information that's repeated elsewhere, you don't need to add a sentence. And sometimes it'll ask about deleting sentences, and you want to ask similar questions. So we're not going to look at an example of this because it's similar to the ones we looked at previously, but this is another type of thing the SAT could ask. So now we come to tone and style questions, some of my least favorite questions on the SAT. These questions can be annoying and very subjective, I'll just say right off the bat. They ask about the writer's tone or the writer's writing style, and these are not concrete things and often difficult things to judge. They're also easier for people who I think have just read more and are more familiar with the conventions of the English language, and just as some of the things we saw in the grammar slides, I think these questions are pretty biased toward native English speakers. But oh well, the SAT asks them. So some useful things that you can ask yourself to try to solve these correctly, narrow in on the best answer, is what matches the stylistic pattern established earlier? Was the stylistic pattern earlier formal or was it informal? And that's usually pretty straightforward to determine, and based on that, which of the choices conforms to it. You can also ask what choice maintains the tone of the passage. The tone of a passage is just the author's attitude. So first you want to think, well, what attitude toward the subject matter is the author taking in this passage? Once you have that, they're angry or they're indifferent or they're trying to remain objective, then you can try to choose an answer choice. But again, this is sort of wishy-washy. We'll see in these examples that follow. So here the author is attempting to maintain a straightforward, formal, academic tone. We want to know which choice best accomplishes this. No change teaches Richard Wright's Black Boy as a masterful example of how an author. That seems relatively formal and academic. Let's say this is cool for now. B. Talks about Black Boy like it's the best book ever because the author. Best book ever, that's not that academic. If choosing between A and B, A is probably the more formal and academic, and a way to get students to think about this is if something sounds like a way you would talk in common speech, like you're talking to your friend just casually and you say something, that's probably not a formal tone. That's probably an informal tone. And when we're talking, we might say, yeah, it's the best book ever, but we probably wouldn't, we would probably say something like that. We might not say it's a masterful example of how an author. So we can tell that this choice B is less formal than choice A. So for now, let's say A is better than B and B's out. C. Can't get enough of Richard Wright's Black Boy because she thinks it's a sweet example of how an author. This is pretty clearly informal. People talk like this and text like this all the time, so it's not a formal tone that we would see in academic writings. C's out. Okay. D. Here's where things get interesting. We could replace it with revels in the exploration of race relations that Richard Wright employs in Black Boy because she luxuriates in an author who, well, that sure sounds formal and academic to me. I've read academic papers that write in this style. But if we look back, it says straightforward, formal academic tone. And if we really think closely, A is a bit more straightforward than D. D has all these extra words and this sort of flowery language, and it does sound academic, but it's not as straightforward and to the point as A. So here we're going to say that the best answer is A, and that's also what the SAT writers are going to say. But again, this is sort of subjective. C is pretty clearly wrong, but the difference between A and B and A and D is difficult to tell. And so just encourage students to do their best on these questions, and if they happen to miss one because it's sort of wishy-washy, oh well. Okay, from my least favorite questions on the test, we go to my favorite questions on this portion of the test. Data interpretation. Questions that ask students to interpret data. So, a strategy to use is RTG. What's that? Read the graphic. Read the graphic, read the graphic, read the graphic. That's all you have to do. These questions are often very straightforward and very easy to answer so long as students read the graphic. Now, often students will get these questions wrong because they look and they see some sort of chart or graph or table, and you think, oh my gosh, it's a chart or table or graph, and that means math, and I can't do math, and then you freak out and you get it wrong. But these questions are not about math. That's for the math portion of the test. They're not going to ask you to perform calculations. They're just asking you to read a graphic. So if you're able to read a graphic, you can get these questions right pretty easily. And this is something to emphasize to students. So now let's look at an example of a data interpretation question. So the first thing we want to do before we see which description matches this is RTG, read the graphic. So this is telling us that the percent increase in employment projected 2010 to 2020 for various categories of jobs. For all occupations, it's 14%. For urban and regional planners, there's a projected increase in employment of 16%. And for social scientists and related workers, 18%. This is good news for me with my sociology degree. Anyway, so that's what the graphic is saying. Now let's see which sentence matches it. So the first one, projecting that 16% of new jobs in all occupations will be related to urban and regional planning. Well, that's interesting. But what I think this table is actually trying to say is that the percent increase in employment projected 2010 to 2020 for urban and regional planners will be 16%. Choice B, it's warning that job growth in urban and regional planning will slow to 14%. No, I think what it's trying to say is that percent increase in employment projected 2010 to 2020 for urban and regional planners will be 16%. Choice D, indicating that 14 to 18% of urban and regional planning positions will remain unfilled. No, I think it might be saying that percent increase in employment predicted 2010 to 2020 for urban and regional planners is 16%. So I'm going to cross D off too. C, predicting that employment of urban and regional planners will increase 16% between 2010 and 2020. Wow, we finally found a description that matches what we've been saying all along, and so C is the correct answer. Read the graphic. There's no excuse to miss these questions unless you're not reading. Okay, good. Now, the final type of question we're going to go through is precision. And this is another type of question that I really don't like, that I don't think the SAT should really be asking, but they do. This is the SAT's discrete way of testing vocabulary. When they redid the SAT, they were like, we're getting rid of that vocabulary section that everyone hates. But then they didn't really completely get rid of it. It's still embedded in the writing and the reading tests through these questions that ask you for the most precise word choice. And really, the only way to solve this is to know what the words that they're asking you about mean, and then choose the best one in context. So this is like vocabulary in context. So, sample number 1. The exchange students were able to view, but not handle, the fragile artifacts at the archaeological site. You have to think here, what is the best word for describing artifacts at an archaeological site? Is it fragile, weak, decrepit, or sickly? We wouldn't really describe artifacts as weak. Sickly doesn't really make sense. Decrepit is similar. Again, it doesn't really make sense. Fragile is the best choice here, but you have to know the definitions of the words to be ordered to distinguish them. So again, it's really testing vocabulary in context. Okay, sample 2. Now here, we've been given a break. We don't actually have to know, well, we sort of do have to know the meanings of these words, but it's a little bit easier than before, because we're asked to choose the least acceptable answer. All of these would be acceptable except for one. Which one? So we just have to see which of these are synonyms. Wonder. You're going to wonder. Well, question is a synonym of wonder. Ponder is a synonym of wonder. Weigh is a synonym of wonder. But awe is not a synonym of any of these things. So awe is the odd man out, and it's the answer. And then here, sample number 3. In Candide, the author and philosopher Voltaire went to great lengths to torment every formal institution of the time, blah, blah, blah. So here we have to think, well, what is someone going to do in a book? Are they going to torment every formal institution? Tormenting seems like a sort of odd thing to do in writing. Are they going to neglect? Well, why would you go to great lengths to neglect something? Neglect is probably not wrong. Bother? Well, how exactly are you going to bother something through writing? Maybe you could, but ridicule you can certainly do through writing. You can certainly ridicule institutions and go to great lengths to do that, and so ridicule is the best answer. But this one is really like wishy-washy, as I've been saying. It's not quite clear. Like, you could bother through writing, and so I don't think this is a great question, but it's from a past SAT, and they could ask something as nitpicky as this. So that's it for this presentation. Here are citations, and see you next week for Lesson 4 videos.